Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I am your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, it is a little bit of a collision course. On the podcast today, I have none other than Peter Defty of OFM, Optimized Fat Metabolism fame, and Vespa fame. And you longtime listeners of the podcast and people who follow me on social media will immediately recognize that the folks over at Vespa, I have given no quarter to in some of their commentary and positions around high carbohydrate diets and high carbohydrate interventions. And it might come as a shock that I'm actually inviting Peter on the podcast today, but although I do stand by those criticisms, I'm still not a hater, and I will admit wholeheartedly that I don't know a whole lot about Vespa's product specifically, and that's because there's not a lot of information out there. And so I wanted to bring Peter on the podcast today to not only explain to me what this product is all about and how it could potentially work, but also to the listeners about what the product is all about. And in addition to that, discuss some of their recent pilot data that they have captured with some of Peter's athletes out in Arizona. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, I'm getting right out of the way. Here is my conversation with Peter Defty, all about Vespa and how it could potentially work for athletes. So we'll get it rolling then. I think as I was just alluding to, like off air, I think I need to start out by saying that obviously I've leveled, a lot of criticism, not a lot, but a little bit of criticism from time to time.
It's all good. It's all good, man.
I want you to personally know, and I want to kind of say this on air as well. And I also want the listeners to know a few things about that before we really get into anything. Because let's face it, if we didn't kind of address it right off the get-go, it'd be weird, right? Because that's what everybody would be expecting. And I don't want weirdness. I actually want to learn. We have to rip the awkward Band-Aid off first, and then we'll get into the meat of everything. So we'll do it. So the first thing that I want you to know, but this is really more important for the listeners, is some of the criticisms that I leveled, I still stand by that. And I know that's a little bit of a super harsh way to start, but give me a little bit of a second with it. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, a lot of that is just because you don't know what's happening or not. I think this will clear it up.
Okay. But there are going to be a lot of people out there who they're wondering exactly why I'm having you on this podcast when I've leveled some of that criticism. And I don't want people to come away thinking that I've changed my perception of that, because I feel that criticism is valid. It's rooted in our current scientific understanding of the physiology, and it's just common sense. But that being said, I've had, and you're aware of this, I've had, and I'll continue to have people on my podcast that I have disagreements with it. That's why I don't take on any sponsors. That's part of why I started this podcast in the first place. And you and a lot of other people are examples of people who I want to bring on the podcast and discuss something despite me making some criticism about some methodology or intervention or anything like that.
Yeah. No, it's all good. And you'll find out. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off, and you'll see about, because one of the things, like with you, I haven't taken any external money or anything because, if I didn't believe in what we're doing with the product and the program, I would have quit doing it a long time ago, because there's been a money. It's been literally the bleeding edge.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that little bit of it.
Yeah.
That
so
little bit of input.
So we got some common ground there. Is we're not going to sell out to people just to sell out.
Good. And I appreciate that about you professionally.
Yeah.
So the second thing that everybody needs to understand, but also I want to make mention of this to you specifically on air, is it's nothing personal. It's never personal. It's just professional. And I know that when we talk about people's specific interventions, whether that be a nutritional intervention or a supplement, people take it personally, and it's nothing of the sort. It's not personal, and you need to know. And I just want to make that abundant. Yeah. And I just want to make it abundantly clear that I don't wish you any ill will or harm. As I mentioned off air, I hope something does come to light from all of this. But it's just a criticism of statements, kind of plain and simple. And the third thing that I think I need to mention, and this is more of just a today's culture than anything else, is that I'm in no way, shape, or form picking on the low carb group or the OFM
Oh,
group
dude, you can
specifically.
pick on the low carb people. The ketard. I don't call them ketards for a reason.
Yeah, well,
It
we'll
for
have some
nothing.
common ground there for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that in like the whole diet wars culture that we have today, all too often, like I said, it does become personal and does seem that, or people take it as we're picking on one group or another. And really, to be honest with you, I'm kind of indifferent. I mean, the longtime listeners of this podcast will know that I just call it as I see it. And
Yeah. You're agnostic. You're trying to be agnostic,
yeah, exactly. And that's
and you're calling it as you see it based on the information you have.
sure.
Yeah.
And that, and if you kind of go through the record, that agnostic viewpoint or that agnostic kind of strategy really prevails, where, you know, I've criticized the Western States 100 for their anti-doping policy, and Spring Energy and SF Fuels for the exact same, you know, marketing stuff that I've criticized you for. I've criticized the vegans going back to my very first podcast with my late great friend David Clark, and I even dedicated my book to him, even though he and I vehemently would like go at each other on, you know, in various
No. I
formats.
think this will be illuminating for both of us, because I think that like Spring Energy and S Fuels, I actually know there's some problems with them. So,
well, sure. And so anyway, I wanted to get like all that out of the way right out of the get-go, because I do want to talk about Vespa.
okay.
And one of the reasons I want to talk about it, and I think you realize this as much as I do, so nobody should really take offense to it, is it's hard for me to find information about it.
Well, we're gonna go into that right now.
Let's do it then. Let's get right into it. What is it?
You're gonna be underwhelmed. Trust me.
Let's go. All right, let's do it, Peter. I'm going to turn the floor over to you. What is, and you can respond to any of that if you want to.
We're live now. We're going.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm good. Yeah. All right. Start me off. Cue me up.
So first off, tell me what Vespa is.
Okay. Vespa is it's actually classed by the FDA as a dietary food. It's classified as a food. It's not classified as a supplement. So that's really important to know, because it's composed of water, honey, bee propolis, royal jelly, and then the very exotic wasp extract, which is really a bioactive oligopeptide that we literally have a proprietary way of extracting from the giant wasp or the murder hornets. Technical name is Vespa mandarinia. And it also has citric or ascorbic acid or orange juice used as a pH buffer, because when you're doing food products, you got to keep the pH low to prevent organisms from growing.
And so what is the difference between your product and the only other similar thing that I can find in the research, which is Vespa amino acid mixture, which will be abbreviated VAM commonly? Because this is a source of confusion that I can't like reconcile.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing that up. There's two products out there, VAM, and there used to be a product called Hornet Juice, which was essentially a knockoff of VAM. And what happened was, when Takahashi Abe, the entomologist, started tracking the giant wasp to figure out what it's about. This is one of these accidental discoveries of nature. What happened was, he found these things, wrote some papers, and he was immediately contracted by Meiji Dairies, which is a big Japanese conglomerate, and what they essentially did was hydrolyze this peptide and then extract out the amino acid compositional profile. And so what they did was they made a synthetic blend of synthesized amino acids that match that compositional profile. So while VAM has efficacy, even in the studies, if you look hard enough and show that they admit that the actual natural peptide had greater efficacy. So the VAM is a different product. They showed in their research, and we'll get into that, that it did have efficacy, and I'm not saying it does, but they get less of an effect and they have to use a much higher dose.
Okay. I do want to get into dosing a little bit, but let's kind of pivot back to like your product. So
Yep.
do you know what the composition of like those core ingredients are? Like you list the ingredients on the ingredient deck, but you know what the amino acid composition is or anything
Yeah,
in
I
there?
I can share those papers out of Japan. But see, the problem is all those papers, the reason we haven't put them up, and you'll understand this because you're really good at finding those things, is because Meiji Dairy was paying Abe a lot of money to do this. That's why it's all slanted. The papers are all slanted about VAM and only scant information, but I can put that all up. It's I can pull it up even.
Yeah. Because what I'm trying to get at is, does your product have a similar or the exact same amino acid profile as VAM? And if so, we can use that as an amino acid analog, right? During the discussion.
Yeah.
And if not, I kind of want to know like why, because that's really not that hard of a chemical process to do. I mean, you can use chromatography to distill down what amino acids are in a substance.
Yeah,
absolutely. Relatively easily.
Absolutely. And I had these a series of conversations with my good friend and ultra running legend Bruce LaBelle about this, because Bruce happens to be a PhD in organic chemistry, and he's the head of the California Department of Toxic Substance Labs. And so we were discussing exactly this thing. And yeah, you can hydrolyze the peptide, get the amino acid compositional profile, but it's not going to have the same efficacy and pathways of action because of the structure. And a lot of that I think has to do with, tight junction signaling in the stomach and gut lining and things like that allow the peptide to pass in intact. I don't have enough. This is beyond my pay grade, but this is stuff I've read about and looked into. So, if you've got the stuff on VAM, that's pretty much what the amino acids are.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's fair to use that as an amino acid analog, although the structure might be different. This is my chemistry background, like coming through here, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In terms of the ingredients, yeah, but the special sauces in that natural structural stuff.
Okay. So you gave a great lead into this. What makes the special sauce so special in terms of the mechanism of action?
Well, you again, for me, it just works. And that's, when I started using it, it worked for me, it's worked for others. But in terms of what I have understood, because of the proline, I think it's the alanine and the glycine, it accelerates input into the TCA cycle, and especially with a non-esterified fatty acids using glycine.
Okay, but here's where, so this story has been told a little bit, right? We've tried to use different amino acids as ergogenic aids for 5 decades now.
Yeah.
And they don't really pan out that well. And here's why, is because they have a hard time actually affecting either beta fatty acid oxidation or the Krebs cycle or glycolysis, now that I'm thinking about it, at their rate limiting steps.
Right.
And this is well-known chemistry, right? I mean,
you've just kind of illuminated some stuff for me, because I've always kind of been a little, the whole branch chain amino acid thing is a little overblown. So I agree with you. And that's why I say, I think the structure of that particular peptide, and I think the honey also has an effect in terms of helping to start, how fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. I think
every freshman level exercise physiology student has just now had that reconjure up in their head, because it's such a common thing.
And so exactly, and so, but it's really centralized around that particular peptide efficacy, and peptides are a big deal right now in sports supplements and stuff.
Yeah, but I understand that. So I'm still trying to I'm still, and this is my original question for you that I sent over in the outline, right?
Mhm.
What is the potential mechanism for action where this is going to actually affect
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
anywhere along
That's,
performance?
yeah. So I, my understanding and observation has been that the biggest effect that this has is it goes right to the liver. And so it's triggering the liver to release free fatty acids. And also it, um, depending on the metabolic need, it'll also take fat and then, and, with glucagon, and it'll produce glucose.
Right. But okay, so let's just say that's true, right?
Yeah.
This is going to get into a little bit of a chemistry lesson. I kind of promised
Yeah.
myself
Yeah.
I wasn't going to go through Krebs
Well,
cycle on a
and
podcast,
dude,
but I might have to
if
do it. But stay with me here, right?
yeah,
So I could buy that, right? I could buy
yeah,
that you can ingest a substance, whether it's an amino acid or a peptide, and somehow it begins the initial catalyst of beta fatty acid oxidation. However, the rate limiting step is not the initial step. And everybody should know this. I mean, freshman level exercise physiology students will know this. The rate limiting step is getting that acetyl CoA into the mitochondria itself. So it's not the initial step. And this is where very commonly a lot of these amino acid supplements have failed, is they do have a potential mechanism of action, but that mechanism of action doesn't actually affect what matters the most, which are these rate limiting steps within these specific metabolic processes. So that's where I'm failing to understand where this process is actually going to have an effect.
yeah. You want me? Let me pull something up and let's
Sure.
look at that. And yeah. So this was the proposed mechanism from Abe initially. Let me pull this up, and this might help, because this is, like I said, this stuff's, you're way ahead of me on the chemistry, Jason. Like I said, I make it work in the real world. So let's go.
So for the listeners, while you're doing that, yeah. So tee that up a little bit, and I'll entertain the listeners for a second. So the research that you're referring to is the original research that this was based on, that was done in the mid 80s, if I'm correct.
Later mid 80s.
Yeah.
Let me see here.
And a lot of it was done on mice and swimming mice as well. And it was kind of done in the same way you do any other mouse study, right? You feed them and you try to determine biochemically what's going on. So you've pulled it up. What's the proposed mechanism of action from those original studies in the late 80s?
Okay, yeah, here we go. Host to stable participant screen sharing. Okay, so share. I'm not getting the thing to. Let me see what, this is weird. Screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Let's see. I might have to enable. I didn't expect you actually share your screen, so let me enable it on my side.
I don't have anything to hide here. Except, I mean, including
nobody
my
takes
ignorance.
that. Normally nobody takes that step. Okay, so all participants can share, so you're good now.
All right.
Those of you who can switch over to the YouTube version, you're going to see here we go. We're sharing your screen right now. There we go. We're going to see see, look at that. You get to fulfill my fantasy of talking about the Krebs cycle.
Yeah, no, all roads. No, I'm totally with you. All roads lead to acetyl CoA, and you have to get there before you're going to feed it.
So what we're seeing right now is a graphical representation of the Krebs cycle and how the various biochemical processes actually feed into the Krebs cycles. Let me tee this up, Peter, and you can kind of organize your thoughts a little bit. So for the uninitiated, because we have a lot of lay audience, so let's kind of set the groundwork, right? So the Krebs cycle is the main biochemical process that describes how we convert energy in the human body. And biochemists have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out exactly where these chemical compounds come from, what catalyzed the reactions, what the rate limiting steps are. But fundamentally, what you're doing is you're taking molecules with big, long chains of carbon, and you're breaking those big, long chains of carbon into smaller chains of carbon. And during that process, you convert energy. Peter's got this pulled up, and whenever we do particularly like nutrition interventions, or sometimes this actually comes out in training interventions, sometimes we can trace it back to a particular part of the Krebs cycle or any of its biochemical cousins, I'll put it that way, as to how that intervention is actually affecting human metabolism. So I'll with that as a backdrop, Peter, I'll kind of turn it back over to you for what is the purported mechanism of action originally when this research came out.
Well, this is the purported mechanism and how proline and alanine sort of get things started by going that these amino acids help to drive the demand for acetyl-CoA through interventions. I think if we go up here, this is the part. I can send you this paper, Jason.
Yeah, I'll link it in the show notes as well. I pulled it up before the podcast.
So, it has to do with these particular amino acids driving it. And I don't, I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't really know all the mechanisms on this. So, but this is the proposal that the proline and the alanine go here, the glycine.
Right. They're either Krebs cycle intermediates or
right.
Krebs cycle precursors that you're adding to the mix of everything. And they are catalyzing these reactions of taking molecules with a lot of carbon and breaking them down to molecules with fewer carbons on them. And at the same time, harvesting or converting energy. I mean, that's
and to a point, I think what you're saying about the rate limiting steps in terms of this particular cocktail that they say, and I think the actual peptide is shown to do better in observational experiences, but it's actually helps to feed those rate limiting steps from this diagram.
Well, no, because once again, the rate limiting step in beta fatty acid oxidation is getting that acetyl-CoA into the mitochondria. And that is catalyzed by a protein called CPT1 and CPT2 that sit on either side of the membrane. So if you're telling me that something is catalyzing the proline cycle, right, which happens before acetyl-CoA actually gets formed. So once again, we've got big carbons going into smaller carbons. Acetyl-CoA is one of the smaller carbons. Proline cycle will feed into that. It kind of doesn't, and this is what I've always had. This is my issue that I've always had with nutrition companies. And I'm going to actually pick on the ones that use sodium citrate as opposed to sodium chloride. There's a number of drink manufacturers out there that will use sodium citrate as opposed to sodium chloride. And their rationale for that is that it's a Krebs cycle intermediary, right? Citrate is a Krebs cycle, which is true. That's absolutely true. But it's immaterial in the whole process because there's so much citrate available. Adding to it is not going to markedly or at all affect the entire process. So when I read Abe's initial research and then some of the data that you sent me in advance of this as well, that there might be an area where it affects the proline cycle specifically, or even the alanine cycle, that same mechanism where the choke point is further downstream than that is still apparent. And once again, this happens all the time in biochemistry. And the way the listeners can think about this is if you have a garden hose and that garden hose is producing energy and you have two valves on that garden hose, one valve will let the water out at 3 gallons per minute, and the other will let water through at 5 gallons per minute. If you open up the 5 gallon per minute valve to 10 or 20 or 30 gallons, it doesn't matter because it still has to go through that 3 gallon per minute choke point. That analogy is what we're talking about with these rate limiting steps in biochemistry, where we have tried to push and pull on them for years with interventions and supplements. And just as it turns out, unless you're directly affecting that rate limiting step, it's just not that you can't do it, because there are other synergistic effects. I'm not trying to like isolate biochemistry into the only thing that matters here, but it just becomes really, really, really hard to do.
And I agree with you. I mean, I'll stop the share.
So let's kind of like back up a little bit. So you've said in your observation, right? And I'm not going to discount that. You know, I give athletes interventions all the time that I can't track back to one exact scientific paper or methodology or whatever. We try to base things in science, but ultimately what we're doing at the end of the day as coaches, and in your coach as well, is we have to create reasonable extensions of the research, right? We have to look at what science is telling us and make a reasonable extension of that to try to apply an intervention or a supplement or a regimen or kind of whatever. So we'll go back to your like observation of how the supplement actually affects athletes. Why don't you start to describe that? And if you need to kind of go through a little bit of an origin story of how these different products have kind of emerged in sports science over the years, like going back to the 80s, you can go ahead and describe that as well.
Well, I think the first appearance of Vespa came in the late 90s, early 2000s in Japan. And so, a number of marathoners used it in the early 2000s successfully. And then for me, everything here is sort of accidental with me. So I did my first marathon in 2000, and I did the whole carb loading thing, and that just turned into a big bonk. Had a sub 3 hour marathon going, and I still finished and got a BQ, but it was ugly the last 6 miles. And I thought, well, this didn't work, and it didn't appear in training because I wasn't carb loading. And that set me off on this whole journey of fat metabolism. So I was open to that idea. And in 2006, I got into the 2006 Western States, and I was training for it. And my friend Paul Charteris at the Western States Memorial Day training camp threw me a couple pouches of Vespa and said, "Hey, my friend Mojo swears by this stuff." And I'd read the label on the back, and it talked about fat oxidation. And so since I was open to the idea, and I was basically, my experience was that consuming a lot of carbs it chronically wasn't working, that I was open to using the Vespa, and I used it in the 2006 Western States. It was my first 100. That was the hottest year in the history of the race. I ran without a shirt from the very start to the very finish, and it got up, I think Miller's defeat, they said it got up to 115 or 118 that year. Anyway, I had no issues, and everything worked fine. And that was my first empirical thing. And then I made it my day job in 2008 formally.
Did the product change when you took it over? Like in terms of where you're getting it sourced from, or? No.
It's a single source proprietary thing. I work very closely with my manufacturing partner in Japan. And it's, it's a food facility. It's not a supplement manufacturer.
And so the once again, I need to be mindful that some of the listeners aren't going to know what it is. It comes in a pouch.
Yeah,
forgive me for the analogy, but it looks like a gel pouch, but it's bigger.
Yep.
And so what's the size?
There's a 2.7 ounce, 80 milliliter pouches, the junior and the CV25. And then we have a little one called the ultra concentrate. That's a little tiny carry pouch but you don't take it like a gel. That's one of the biggest mistakes people make, because it's actually got 175 milligrams of wash extract. And so that's as much as a CV25 or a junior together. So if people just take it like a gel, they might get a little stomach issues. Whereas if they dilute it like you're supposed to, it works just fine.
So along both of those delivery mechanisms,
Mhm.
how did you determine that that's the right amount to be
I, I
delivered?
I didn't. I didn't. That was how it was presented to me, and it worked for me. And I'll be frank and honest about it.
But it's
Um,
just the way it came, and so you were like, we're just going to use this
we're gonna
dosing.
run with it, literally.
Yeah, because once again, so I'll tell you like my experience as a coach, right?
Mhm.
I have an athlete that comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to take this supplement. Doesn't matter kind of what it is." I kind of go through a few things right out of the gate. First off, what's in it, right? I need to go and figure out like chemically, like what's in it. And you know the supplement. And I hate to use the supplement analogy because I know your product is not a supplement,
Yeah.
but but as you know, the supplement industry is just rife with bullshit, right? I mean, there's
Oh,
so many products that don't contain what they're supposed to contain on the
Jason,
label.
when I did my due diligence to become a partner, equity partner in the company and take over the distribution in the US and Europe and all, I almost didn't do it because when I did looked at the supplement industry, it's like
Yeah, it's fucked. I mean,
it's
excuse my
like
French. It's
it,
like
it, it,
it's
it
totally
it's
fucked.
yeah, and the profits, it's like we don't have a profit margin like other supplements because the cost of ingredients for what we're doing is just, exponentially like, 10x, 20x
Yeah,
higher
yeah.
than.
I get it. No, I
Yep.
get it. I mean, CTS was involved in the supplement industry in the early 2000s, and so I got to see the hairy backside of that. And trust me, I don't want any piece of it either. But
Yes.
my point with that is my run a show as a coach, and athletes approach me with this all the time, whether I work with them or whether I just kind of interact with them. I always want to know what's in it, and sometimes it's easy to figure out, and other times it's difficult. And then the second thing I want to know is what is the correct dosing based on what the literature says and what's in it, because we know that everything in chemistry and particularly with supplements is all about correct dosing. And you just mentioned the supplement industry earlier. This is one of like the dirty little secrets, is everybody hides behind proprietary blends. And
Yep.
the reason that they hide behind proprietary blends is they're trying to use as little of the really expensive ingredients as possible, yet still make all of their claims. And that's a total aside
No,
that we don't need to really talk
no, and
about.
I get you because but what they'll do is they'll cite papers on that specific ingredient
100%. 100%.
and but it's not directly tied to the efficacy of the product.
100%.
Yeah, yeah, no,
100%.
we're on board with
100%.
that.
And so I carry that forward.
Mhm.
And once again, I hate to use a supplement analogy with
Yeah,
Vespa
yeah, no,
because I
we're
know it's a
good.
food. I know it's a food product, but I still have a hard time determining what's in it, like we talked about earlier. But B, you've got this dosing that's just based off of history, more
Yeah.
than anything else. Somebody at some point in time
There was
came up
no
with the correct.
formal, yeah, there's no formal stuff. And really what what's kind of interesting about this, Jason, is the fact of the matter is for you and your listeners, it's kind of exciting for me because at the time I took over, it was mainly being distributed to hockey and figure skating, which was really a dead end, even because the guys were Canadian, they wanted out. They just gotten tired of it. They were totally knew what the potential for the product was, but they only knew how to market it to hockey players, and it had a pretty interesting underground following in hockey. Um, but what's happened here, where the point I want to make is the exciting thing is we're doing that empirical science right here in ultra running. I mean, it's, ultra running's kind of on that for what we're doing. We're literally on that edge of the human performance envelope to see what happens. And that's where the empirical science is. And, the reason we got this conversation is because I've finally gotten to the point where I can start to put some money into to developing data. And this is going to lead to a study. We can talk about that in a bit. But I mean, I have a researcher who's really keen on doing a research project, and so that's where we are. But it's really, it's fellow ultra runners, not just myself, but fellow ultra runners over the last 14 years who have kind of brought it to this, because the first time I did a online interview. It was with Scott Dunlap.
Yeah.
And he uses the product. He swears by it. And he was using it. He was one of the early adopters. And he says, yeah, it works. This works great. Had me on, and we got absolutely skewered in the comments. And so, and it's okay. I get it, because all the science is based on carbohydrate physiology. And so, this is not very,
but you have to be fair. There's no science on this.
Well, that's what the point I'm making is we're doing the empirical science, because science starts with observation. And now, at this point, we're getting enough data points, and we're developing data to get it to that science.
So I want to give you the opportunity to go over some of that observation, because once again, I observe things as a coach, and sometimes that's all I have to go by. I always try to trace it back to something logical or research that I've reviewed or something like fundamental about physiology. But sometimes all you have to go off of is observation. I'm kind of completely with you on there. So I do want to give you the opportunity to kind of go through that observation so that the listeners can kind of understand this is what you are seeing in the field with athletes who have tried this food product. So you want to go ahead and describe that in any way that you want to, whether it's an early adopter or some of the current athletes that are using it.
Well, I think what let's just talk about in general principles, like what's consistent, what are we seeing consistent with all these athletes. And the listeners should know that I've worked with people from, elite people all the way to back of the packers. We have people in their 70s and 80s who are just back of the packers, and they're finding they can have it. But what we've noticed with the Vespa is one of the reasons why it's easier to develop some form of empirical data in ultra running, not the testing we've done, we'll get into that, but is the fact that you can put a metric on it. A hockey player can say, yeah, I played my third period a lot better.
Yeah.
But that's not I get it. That's not science. But with ultra running, we can see people running 100 miles on less than 1,000 calories of intake. That's a pretty hard metric. And that just, it precludes the risk of GI distress. People observe that they're much steadier in terms of the ups and downs in energy, mental focus. But that's not really, that's more of a perceived thing. And then the other thing is the recovery is markedly better. And I want to reframe this. The reason people actually recover better is because they haven't done the damage in the first place from the oxidative stress and lactate load.
Okay. That's reasonable. I want to get into some of the pilot data that you have recently released. And a previous guest on this podcast, Jeff Browning, who introduced me to, who was responsible for my introduction to ultra running, let's put it that way, participate in this. And like I said, I've had him on the podcast earlier. Why don't you take the listeners through like the kind of the origin story behind collecting this pilot data, and then what the design was. And
I'm going to call it data collection.
Data collection.
Call it pilot. It's not, but it's not science. I want people to know it's not formal science. We do have we'll have a pilot data sheet. I think I sent that to you from, from St. Mary's on Cyclist, but so I'll back up. Yeah. I hope you don't like detours down different rabbit holes.
Oh, dude, much. It's your rabbit hole, man. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I finally got, the rabbit hole started in 2010 when somebody said to me, hey, you ought to go talk to this guy. He's kind of on board with what you're doing. And it was an article in the SACB about Steve Finney.
Yeah.
And, about fat burning and all. So I had lunch with him, and that started a series of conversations. He found out, he goes, you're doing empirically what the science shows. And Steve is he's like totally into the ketogenic diet. And, he had his cycling study out, and he's just, was big on it. So what he'd found with me was, I found a researcher who actually knew what I was doing actually worked. because being in Davis at the time, Liz Applegate, all that, it was total dismissal. So we started getting together because Steve's secret passion was athletes, and that led to the 2012 Western States study. And so that study was done on a cohort of high carb conventional athletes and athletes I was working with who were fat adapted and using Vespa. And that data never got published, but what happened out of that data, and it was ultra running that was doing it. This was science. So they were taking cheek cells, blood samples, pre-race, and then post-race, and then post-race out a few days. And then they were taking cheek cell swabs to look at oxidative fatty acid compositional profile changes and oxidation at the start at Forest Hill, post race, and then they did it for I think 3 days after, and then they sent a kit to everybody to send 2 weeks after. So what they saw in that study, they didn't want to publish it in a low tier journal because it was Steve and Jeff Volek and Steve Finney, so they didn't want to publish it in a low tier journal, so they didn't publish it. So, and I think you can confirm with the readers that there's a whole tiering of in academia of ranking system of publications, and people can get stuff like you alluded to with the supplement industry. You can get stuff published in a crap journal and people won't know the difference.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah. So anyway, that data was pretty stark in that on the recovery side, what was statistically significant, and I can send you that data, was the people in the OFM Vespa cohort recovered really fast.
Based on what markers?
Recovery in fatty acid compositional profile.
So were they looking at like creatine kinase levels or interleukin 6 or?
No, they were looking at fatty acids, the fatty acids and the oxidative stress.
Okay, going back to the old King Cooper days.
I don't know.
I grew up right next to King Cooper's, the Cooper Clinic in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up. I did an internship there a long time ago. Anyway, okay, so that research never got published. So they keep going down the rabbit hole.
So, but that so impressed them that led to the faster study.
Okay, so origin story of the faster, origin story for the Vespa is an origin story for the faster study.
Well, it's not. We're getting there. Okay, but we're talking about the research. Okay.
Okay. So let's lay the groundwork for the faster study, because once again, I'm familiar with it. You're obviously familiar with it. Let's give the listeners just the nickel version of its significance.
Why don't you give your nickel version, and then I'll add context.
Oh, sweet. So the faster study took a cohort of athletes. Well-designed study in terms of they had them in a nutritional ward for your testing my memory on the week 6 weeks. Is that right?
No. They weren't even in an award. They were just tracking their data, and they were only there for I think 2 or 3 days for the actual testing, but they were keeping them on a pretty tight record in terms of their diet. It was pretty. They didn't have any nutritional wards.
Okay. So the fundamental part of the study is they had them exercise at 60%. You're going to have to correct me on the percentages here. 60% of their VO2 max for 3 hours.
60 or 65. Yeah.
Yeah. For 3 hours before a low carbohydrate intervention. Would you call it low carbohydrate or optimized fat?
Actually, this is where we need to talk. This is where we get the reader. Okay. So what it was,
it's obviously been a while since I've reviewed the study. So go ahead.
No, it's all good. Since I was part of the design and the recruiting, I've got a little bit more, and I don't probably look as near as many papers as you do. So they had 2 cohorts. They were comparing 2 cohorts. We recruited a bunch of people who were your normal diet, normal fueling, ultra runners, people like Mike Wardian.
Sure.
And they recruited a bunch of people who were essentially on my program or doing carbohydrate restriction. And they matched them very carefully in terms of age, ranking their profile in terms of how well they did in races. And then they tested them on a 3-hour treadmill. They did a VO2 max test and a 3-hour treadmill test. And then they did a bunch of, blood draws, biomarkers, including a muscle biopsy.
Mm-hmm.
And the take home was the take home data is it shifted the science, because previous to Faster, the science up to that date basically suggested that humans can burn up to 1 gram a minute in peak fat oxidation. And the crossover was right in line with George Brooks' crossover concept of 65, a well-conditioned athlete, 65% of their VO2 max will cross over from fat to carbohydrate. Faster changed all that with an average of 1.54 grams per minute, and the crossover shifting to 75 to 80%. Now, and this is leading up to why we're doing research. I told you. Okay, so it led up to this. So it changed the science in terms of what human potential is. But to control variables, and I get it. The control variables, they kept it at a ketogenic diet, the low carb cohort.
Yeah, okay. But so you're saying that study shifted the science from what we previously thought was the highest rate of fat oxidation to a new rate of fat
oxidation. And
the intensity level of crossover. Yep. Totally get that.
Yep.
But if you're looking at it, this is the sky is blue type of result. If you put people on a low fat or a ketogenic diet,
I'm totally with you, Jason.
Yeah. So
totally, this was the problem with Faster, is they were matching them up based on performance, but that performance, I actually coached, I think all but 1 or 2, maybe. I don't know a couple of the guys in there, but all the other people, I actually either coached them or got them started on their fat adapted journey. And in their races, they were OFM and Vespa, which means when they're OFM, once you get them fat adapted, you got to bring the carbs back in. And you'll have no argument with me. And that was so this is where we're getting to the point of your question, is the problem with Faster was the inference was you can perform as well on keto as you can on fat. And it really has set to me, it's really set us back in terms of everybody trying to move things forward in terms of both performance and health, because you're right. You're absolutely right. You cannot perform on a straight keto diet because it's a conservation physiology, and it's basically turning the governor down.
But in addition to that, I contest this whole notion that regular mixed macronutrient athletes can achieve carbohydrate or fat oxidation rates of above 1.5, because I have that data and I just reanalyzed it. Sorry, I'm kind of like springing this on you.
This is good. This is good. This is going in the right direction.
But I have a good cohort of very, very similar to the Faster study in terms of, how good they are, if you want to think about it like that. And when I analyze the top 10, eight out of the top 10 are above 1.5. And what I'll also say is we use a different protocol, shorter protocol, which is you're very well aware of, is going to blunt the absolute number that you get from, or the highest number that you'll get from a fat oxidation study. And the second thing is we use 20-second rolling average versus a 2-second or a 3-second rolling average, which is always going to bring the maxes down. So when I look at that, I'm like, well, wait a minute, hold on. You're not rewriting textbooks, which is something that I hear out of that study, right? You're not rewriting textbooks. Like, we've got this data that already exists. Yeah, it might not be as well known, but let's temper the jets a little bit on the significance of all this. So let's get back to the observational piece, right? You went down the rabbit hole. Right. Now we have the Faster study. How does that lead into Vespa in terms of people's use research and what you observe?
Okay, so here's the thing. Because Faster inferred, and I got dropped. I mean, unfortunately, Steve and Jeff, they got what they needed, and because they thought it was really all about the diet, and Vespa really doesn't have it, because they were asking the same questions you are. Vespa doesn't have any science behind it. So they thought all this performance gains were, I think that their thinking was all the performance gains had to do with the ketogenic diet. And I would offer that, carb restriction at certain times is important, but using carbs is that. So post faster, I'm like, where are we going to go with this? So I knew that the performance that these athletes were seeing, the people, like, let's just talk elite level, they're winning races, setting records, that, it had to do it. So that's where I started my journey to try and get some data developed. And, it's just hard. And I didn't have like tons of money to throw at this. So it's led to, so from 2015, 16, when Faster was published, I started looking around, and then 2017 or 18, we started to try to develop some of that data. And then I finally met Dr. Marks, and then Jeff had his some testing done on him, which you've seen, and you brought that up. And then we tested Jeff a couple of years ago at Utah State University, and I'm going to get that data processed and up too. So so Dr. Marks started a study in the late 2019 and 2020 using cyclists, and that of course got nixed. So with the whole COVID thing. So here's my thing though. Even with that, you've got a product that's been on the marketplace for 20 years. Yep.
And there's not one single solitary modern day research intervention study that has analyzed it. Like you've got to understand that I'm not only representing like my opinion of this, but there's a lot of people that have like told me this as well. They're like, why has this been on the shelves for so long? And the claims are, so incredible, yet there's not one scant piece of research to actually show for it.
Because to be frank with you, I mean, until 2015, when I started looking for it, I personally didn't. I'm like, it works for these people. They're winning races. Observational evidence is the start of science. And I think people forget that, Jason. And I don't want to get a back and forth on that, but I had to get reality. Yeah, we need to develop some science around this. Okay. But the other thing is, because this is so, disruptive. The product is so disruptive in its approach and its manufacturer. It's tough because we don't, like I said, we don't have the margins to throw a lot of money at research to show that it works.
Okay. All right. Well, I get the real-time limitations and the financial limitations of small business. Trust me, I've been in small business my whole life, going back to my grandfather's shoe store in the 60s and 70s. So I get it. I mean, I'm not going to knock you for not, throwing around capital to get research done, but you have to understand that that's a reasonable criticism. The gap
it's
time.
Absolutely reasonable. And this is exactly why I spent the money this February to start developing some real data. And we're actually going to continue that, because the data is really interesting now that I'm kind of nutting into it. And I actually have you to thank for that, because if you hadn't got this interview going, wouldn't gotten me off my butt to really start nutting into it.
Well, I had to hack together the raw data to make sense of it. I couldn't just rely on it already being done. So, all right, I could be.
Yeah, no. And I've got some graphs. I found a package. There's a company that was just acquired by Canva that has a program. So I just really crudely took the raw data, and we can show some screen shares of what that data is seeing. So, I mean, I would offer to you that this is like a big opportunity for you to participate as part of the research team, because you're the guy that's going to say, oh, look at this isn't it. You got to have vetting, and I'm not scared to have somebody who has a different voice. I actually want that, because if you don't know if everybody's saying, oh yes, that looks wonderful, you don't know to dot your I's and cross your T's.
Well, okay, so here's what I'll offer up, right?
Yeah.
You want to send me a placebo and actual Vespa that I can't tell the difference. I'll go down to my metabolic cart that I've got 3 blocks from now, and I'll do whatever test design you want on it.
I was gonna offer you that and say, if you want to come do testing and do that, you're welcome.
I don't mind doing that. I do that all the time. That's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've beaten around the bush with this pilot data a little bit, and I'm glad that you're taking the right tone with this. That it's just very simplistic pilot data that you're gathering. In fact, you probably have a hard time even just saying data, right? Because it's just numbers at this point. But I do take a little bit of time to explain to the listeners why you're being so cautious around it, first off. And then also, let's kind of go into the mechanics of how you're gathering that data, and then what initially you were drawing from it. Because once again, it's not the first time, because you've got the graduate work from St. Mary's that exists, but it is of the limited information that exists around this product. It's at least something to grab onto, and I think you got to start somewhere. We got to start somewhere,
and we'll nut into the data here in a second, but the reason I'm being cautious with it is, frankly, I've got my BS in biology from UC Davis. I don't have a biochemical degree or anything like that, and I struggled just to get out of UC Davis. I got hammered the first 2 years by the pre-med.
You and I are the same way, man. I was solid C student on my best day.
Oh, so man. Yeah, I know. The first 2 years I had to take all the general coursework with the pre-med students at Davis, and it was like getting slaughtered. So, and some of the people I run with, like Bruce LaBelle, he was like one of the top finishers in Western States in the early 80s. Anyway, he's a PhD biochemist. And then another gal I ran with, Ling Ru, she's a PhD in animal behavior. And then my former wife is a basic researcher and gets her in her field. She and it's plant pathology, soil science. She gets all her stuff published in top tier journals. And I've also worked with Steve Finney and Jeff Volek. So I know what good science is, and I'm not the one to do it. In terms of experimental design, controlling the variables, all those things, it's like, that's why when you said pilot study, it's like, no, it's not pilot study, it's just pilot data.
I had to cross that out like 5 times on my outline, pilot data, because that's, because you know enough to know how studies can be designed a certain way, and the stats, the old saying about statistics, there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. Yeah.
So I know enough to know why I have to be very careful with this, because it is what it is. And really most of what this is doing is it's providing a lot of insights for the athletes who got tested, and it's going to provide insights to athletes who want to look at it. And it'll all be on the Vespa site next week in a summarized form.
We're sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. I'm always reminded of this because there's a delay between when we record and I push out. So we're recording this April 28th, so it'll be out first week in May.
Yeah.
That's probably before or just as this podcast is actually coming.
Right. Okay. So, and that was my goal all along, is to make all this stuff transparent, but just it's data. But as we go along, I want to do it. And when we talk about this data, I'll show, we'll talk about some stuff, and this is why we're going to be doing some testing. And in terms of scientific method, it's a little bit kind of sort of. And if we wanted to, if I had a PhD and looked like I could probably fool a lot of people, right? And thinking it's science, but it's not. I'm sitting there and looking at, well, what about this? What about this? Because it's hard to control the variables, and that's a big part of doing well done science.
Hey, listen, I get all that. Trust me, I've been in those situations a lot where we have companies come and approach us and want to use our lab to gather this type of stuff. And sometimes you do what the client says, and then sometimes you're like, no, this is kind of dumb. This is the way you need to do it, and offer, kind of counsel that way. And I get it. Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is I get it, because I've been in that consulting role, not in a role where I own the product, but I've been in that consulting role a number of times where you got to get something on the board. And a lot of times you have to make kind of compromises or sacrifices for what would be viewed as a proper scientific method, scientifically controlled study. So I get it.
Yeah.
So let's kind of run through like just what you were doing with the athletes, a group of athletes that you kind of picked out that you know and that you work with. What did they do?
Well, this, in my hunting around for how we can get some testing done, one of the guys I work with, a cycle coach named John Benson up in Flagstaff, said, "Hey, I was asking about getting testing done because, as you know, I've got a pocket of athletes in the Phoenix Flagstaff area, in Nick Curry, Jeff Browning, Peter Mortimer, and then Anthony Kunkel spends a fair amount of time in the Phoenix area. So I had these, athletes who'd been on the program a long time. So we organized in February to do it, and we had actually up to 9 or 10 people. But like Michael McKnight, he got COVID right. He was coming down, so Jeff said, "Don't come down." And then the buddy he was going to drive down with from Utah, of course, wasn't going to come down then.
Just too far there, yeah.
Right. Ben Light didn't have COVID, but he wasn't going to ride in a car with Mike. Right. Yeah. So this is what happens when, by the way, for all the listeners out there, this is a realistic story of when you're gathering initial information about a product or intervention. You get volunteers to do it just based off of goodwill. You're usually not paying them. You're running something in a very simplistic format with not a lot of money, and it's easy for people to bail. So trust me, man. It's cat herding on a high level, right?
You're correct with that. Okay, so you're getting these athletes down there.
So we had I think we had over 10, and it got pared down to 6. So it was Peter, Jeff, Anthony, Nick and Lauren Curry, Nick's wife. And then we got Jesse to come out, Jesse Haynes from Southern California. Right. So we got the athletes lined up. And based on testing that Jeff had done previously, the couple tests we'd done before, and just thinking about what works and what didn't, we designed a protocol like this. Like 20, 30 minutes before the warm up, they took a Vespa Ultra Concentrate. And then they did a half-hour outdoor warm up at the facility. So just easy jog warm up. Because the data I see, and once again, this is empirical data. I kind of look for at least a half-hour warm up for workouts and everything else, because what we see in the data is what I call the switch, where you're really regulating your fat oxidation occurs around 32 to 33 minutes. So we do a half hour, and that's been corroborated by these athletes. They just feel this switch when you get this really sharp upregulation of fat oxidation. So we did a 30-minute warm up, and then got on the treadmill a couple minutes to calibrate, right, to make sure the machine's working. And then the treadmill was set at 2% grade, which simulated, I guess, flat surface. That's what we'd worked out. And
it's supposed to accommodate for wind resistance, but
right, exactly. Yeah. So 2% grade and 6 miles an hour speed.
Okay, so your starting point is easy.
Starting point is easy. Yep. And it was 4 minutes. And then what was the data? Was it half a mile,
so 4 minute stages, and I think that's immaterial. You increase the intensity.
No, we increase the speed, right? So
increase the speed. So the intensity goes
up to 9 miles an hour. And the problem we had was this particular treadmill would shut off at 10 miles an hour. Anything over 10 miles an hour would shut off. It would just.
Did you get a limit or something? Come on.
I don't know. I mean, this was what's available, and they the facility was this really fancy facility in Scottsdale, but yeah, they had this janky, and I'll tell you, it gets better actually, but it gets better, but it's, you take lemons and make lemonade. I'll tell you that story later, but so we had to go up to be safe.
You have a graded exercise test.
Right. We went up to 9 miles an hour. And then after that, we raised it 1% every 4 minutes till they tapped out.
Okay. And you're taking, so that's an important part. So it's volitional exhaustion, right? They have to
Yes.
jump off the treadmill, straddle the treadmill, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
not shutting down. I think
Nope.
I'm going to bring that up in a second. You're taking gas exchange, right?
Gas exchange. Yep.
Anything else?
We didn't take blood. No blood samples.
Okay. So
at
no
this
blood
point.
samples, no lactate.
No
So just
lactate.
gas
Nothing
exchange.
like that at
Okay.
this point.
And it was also my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you had the participants come into the test fasted, like
Yes.
from an overnight fast.
Yes.
So they slept. This test was mid-morning, I'm assuming. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Just because we wanted to control variables.
Yeah, but you could just tell them to eat the same thing they always eat.
Most of these guys do fasted runs in the morning.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
Remember, we're in my world, Jason.
Okay. All right, that's good. All right, I'll take that. I'll take
Most of
that.
these guys are their normal training is fasted. They pop a Vespa and hit the trail,
Okay. All
or they
right,
have a
fair
coffee. I mean, it's like
so you're doing the same thing. Do what you normally do.
yeah. They might have a coffee, like Jeff might have a coffee or something. Now, the other thing that's important to know is I purposely, because of the time frame we had to do this testing, I purposely scheduled things to rig it against Vespa, because we did one test and then approximately 24 hours later, the second test occurred. And you've done plenty of these tests. I've done a test or two of these. Everybody knows when you do a VO2 max test, you burn some matches. It's not the same as going out for a 3 or 4 hour trail run.
But okay, hold on. Let's pause there because I do want to bring this up. So you designed the intervention such that the control, so the non-Vespa condition, was the first test.
Right.
And then 24 hours later was the Vespa condition, not placebo controlled, right? So they know
no, there's no placebo control. At this point. Yeah.
So, which is fine. I mean, you probably could have placebo controlled it, but that's neither here nor there. But this contention that you're stacking the deck against Vespa, it's actually the opposite. So first off, how out of the athletes besides Jeff have done exercise testing before?
Well, Anthony Kunkel was in the faster study.
Oh, okay. So you got two of them that were in the study.
Yeah,
okay,
I think Nick's probably done it, but Nick's probably done a VO2 max test. I don't know that for sure, but Jesse hasn't, Peter hasn't.
Okay, so I understand the conventional wisdom that if you do two back-to-back VO2 max tests, the conventional wisdom would say, yeah, of course you're worse on the second one because the first one is hard. And you're telling people to go as hard as they can. And then you're telling them to come back at the second day and go as hard as they can. Yeah, naturally you would say in your words, they've burned a few matches, but the data is actually the opposite, particularly if all you're concerned about is VO2 max. And you can understand that particularly in nutrition intervention studies, where they don't want a training effect to occur between test 1 and test 2, they have to get the right amount of time between those two tests to not have a training or detraining effect so that the tests are fair across each other. And so my point with that is research has kind of like looked at this ad nauseum. Do we need to wait 1 day? Do we need to wait 3 days? Do we need to wait 4 days? And kind of the common one is you want to wait 3 or 4 days.
Yeah. And I would be up with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that once again, that's common. But if you really look into the data, you can see up to 4 tests in a single day, with no deterioration in VO2 max. The staging might be different, but the VO2 max numbers will not be. But in addition to hold on, I'm not done. In addition to that, particularly with athletes where the testing is novel, there is either a learning effect from one test to the next because you know what you're in for. And you can imagine, everybody out there can, put their imagination hats on and think about this. You're going as hard as you can on a treadmill with all this gear hooked up to you that you've never experienced before. And you're asked to voluntarily jump off the treadmill when you think you're done. Anybody who's ever done that one time, once they get off the first time, they're like, shit, I could have gone 30 more seconds. And you've been around enough testing that you know that that's a common piece of feedback. And we actually see the data actually play that out as well, where if you have somebody do consecutive tests, even in a day, they will either perform the same on the second test or even better. So I would, once again, you haven't published this, so now you can like take that information with what you will. But this notion that the way that you ordered the test was stacked against Vespa, I would completely contest that notion. But you could have just switched it. Like you could have just said you're
Yeah.
going first and you're going, like you could have controlled that. So it's just like that whole piece of the
Okay.
data collection.
I mean, that's fair enough. And I think in terms of VO2 max, I'm not sure that there's a big change. I just think that,
but even in the staging, because the athletes know what they're aiming at, right? So for the athletes who have never been through it, they kind of don't know. But then once they go through the test, they're like, oh, I got to stage 10 or 6 miles or 10 miles an hour or whatever it is. They have something to aim at. Competitive athletes, they want to always, especially now that they have
some metrics to shoot for.
They have some metrics to shoot for, but now they have an intervention, right? That's like, oh, this is supposed to make me better anyway. So anyway, I mean, I would, once again, I would definitely,
and that's fair enough. And that's why, that's why we have to do placebo controlled double blind, sampling so that people don't know whether they're using the Vespa or not, and space out I think that spacing it out 3 or 4 days, that's
a better protocol. But anyway, yeah. I use that because I heard a couple of athletes bring that up, that the testing stacked against Vespa, to which I was like, no, I've been around testing enough. That's not the case at all. In fact, usually it's the opposite. Whenever you bring in somebody for 2 consecutive tests, usually they're trying to beat their previous time, irrespective of an intervention or not. And sometimes you just do the test just to get the first one out of the way. Like that's just
right.
So anyway, let's get back to the fundamental piece.
Yeah.
So graded exercise test. First time around, there was no intervention. Second time around, they took a Vespa 30 minutes before. What does the metabolic cart tell you?
Let's see. Let's have a look. Do you want to have a look?
Yeah, go ahead, put it up on the screen. This might be the first time I've seen it. I've just seen the raw data. So
you've seen the raw data. So let me go ahead and hold on. Let me pull this up. Let's start with Jeff Browning. This is screen share. Okay. So Jeff Browning, he just did that Grand Canyon crossing, caught the weather right. Let's see if this is, okay, this is his first one fasted, and he came into this pretty well conditioned and staying pretty low carb into the thing. Let me see, can I pull this up?
Yeah, so while you're resizing that, for those of you on the YouTube version, so what you're looking at is a graph where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is the metabolic data. It looks like you've got it kind of, I can't see it anymore. It just looks like it was the carb fat or the macronutrient split, right? Yeah, there we go.
Right, there's your carb. He actually didn't cross over on the fasted test, and his data is showing him burning, this is 1100 kcals. I can't get the sizing to work for me. I wonder if we can. There we go. Okay, so this is 1100 here's 1100 kilocalories right here. That's 2 grams a minute.
Which is consistent with his previous tests, right?
Yeah.
Came on my podcast earlier.
Right. Well, he didn't pull it that long for that long, but yeah, that's consistent with what, but this is fasted. This isn't even fasted with Vespa. And he pushed it pretty hard, but Jeff and I were talking about this, and he feels that because he uses Vespa all the time in training, it also helps him in terms of his level of fat adaptation now.
So hold on. What's remarkable about that?
Well, I think these data points showing that he's pushing above 2 grams a minute for a pretty substantial portion of that test is remarkable.
Once again, I'll give you a little bit of that, but what you have to understand, you have an athlete who's going into this fasted, and I think this is a point that I'll make it now because I'll make it across the board.
Sure.
Whenever you're doing exercise testing on athletes that are in a fasted state versus a non-fasted state, they're always going to burn more fat in a fasted state because they don't have carbohydrate on board. I mean, that's been universally shown for years. And as I indicated in the data that I have, when I see this, quote unquote, remarkable 2 grams per minute, I don't look at it as that anomalous within an ultramarathon cohort, because there are a lot of ultramarathon athletes that go into these types of tests. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I had Chris Rosh, who you should be familiar with, on my podcast a few weeks ago, that has ultra endurance and ultramarathon data that's not quite at 2, but indicates that people can get up that high in a non-fasted, quote unquote fat adapted state.
I mean, I won't disagree with you, because a well-conditioned, well aerobically conditioned ultra endurance athlete, they're going to burn fat by default, because glucose isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
Entirely. There's no debate there.
Okay, so this is just his baseline. We'll call it that, right?
This is baseline, but he's burning, like, even when you go up here to the 1200, where that's around 2.5 grams, that's pretty remarkable. And it's not like he's dipping down, or it's just a peak fat oxidation. This is pretty steady, and it's pretty steady amount of time. We're talking from about 22 minutes all the way up to when he taps out at 33, 36 minutes.
Okay. So let me kind of rephrase the remarkable part of this, because freshman exercise physiology students will recognize this as well. When you do a maximal fat oxidation test on a person, that's not going to be this intervention. It's going to look slightly different in terms of the intensities that they're going at. You see different curves emerge based on the subject that you are testing. So most of those curves look like an inverted N. No, look like an N, an inverted U. Sorry, I'm having hard time with the alphabet this morning, right? Where there's a peak, and this is what you're referring to, Peter. There's a peak amount of fat oxidation at a particular point, and then once you continue to increase intensity, that fat oxidation starts to tail off, and carbohydrate oxidation subsequently increases. What you're saying, to paraphrase it, that's remarkable, is that you don't see that inverted U shape with Jeff. It just keeps going up and up and up and up. Is that a fair chemical reconciliation of that description?
Yeah, and he holds it, and that's consistent with some of the other data we got, which we'll go through. But then if we go to data here with the fasted with Vespa, what's remarkable here is, he does cross over, because, like I said, I don't think his VO2 changed much, but his substrate utilization did, and part of that's from not being recovered from the first day, is what I surmise, but you'll disagree with me. It's okay. We can have different positions. But he also went a couple of minutes, about 2 minutes fat longer to exhaustion, which but once again, in terms of his output, it's still, very high output.
Is this, so let me ask you this, because we're going to, since most of the people are going to be listening to the podcast version of this versus looking at the YouTube, is this result similar across this group of athletes, where when you compare the baseline condition, the baseline fasted condition, to the Vespa condition, you see higher rates of carbohydrate oxidation and the crossover points start to emerge a little bit earlier? Or is it inconsistent across this cohort where that's happening?
There's let's look at Anthony's, because he was probably the best condition, because he had just come off the Phoenix Marathon a week earlier. So that's his fasted.
It's not up on the screen. I've got the data, but
sorry.
Yeah, there we go. It's all good.
There we go. All right. There's his fasted. And then let's go ahead and there's
so similar.
Similar.
I mean, I'm just eyeballing it, but yeah, very similar.
Yeah. But the crossovers also, they're all crossing over like 85 to 90, low 90% of VO2 max.
Here's the
I
deal. Here's the
yeah.
deal. You're testing the Vespa condition, right? I mean, that's the thing that you're changing from athlete to athlete. So what I'm trying to pinpoint is not where the crossover point or how much of a particular substrate is being oxidized at any one particular point, but how it changes from the control to the intervention.
Yeah, and that's interesting because here's one of the things. Comes back to the whole lame treadmill test. So I'll show you Peter's stuff here. This is Peter's.
You changed the thing on your on the.
Yeah,
on the
I'll
Zoom
share
so
it
you
right
can
now.
check it.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good.
Oh, all right. There's Peter Mortimer's fasted treadmill test. Now, what happened was, oh shoot. Okay. So what happened with him was when he went to do his second test the next day, he got to the 9 mile an hour mark. And the moment they raised the gradient, the machine shut down. So we had to reschedule. So
I've had that happen before, by the way. Oh, actually, I'll tell you a better story. We were filming it one day and one of the cameramen kicked the plug out, like probably 1 or 2 stages after threshold. So the athlete was actually going really hard and the machine all of a sudden came to an abrupt stop and I had to catch him.
Oh,
and
wow.
He was a regular size human being, like not a little wispy 130-pound person. Like I had to like come in and make sure he didn't slam against and luckily I was paying attention.
Right.
But he was going to like literally take a step and slam himself and like face plant against a wall, right? He would have hit the control board before we would hit the wall. But it was really bad. The camera guy felt awful and got an earful. So anyway, I feel your pain there.
Yeah. So we had to reschedule. So this was taken the end of March, the 25th of March. So, and this was after he said his week, he'd done a big volume trail running training week. So he got that training effect. Okay. So he wasn't doing anything high intensity to burn mitochondrial matches or anything like that. But when you look at this, and then the day before he took 7 vials of blood, they took 7 vials of blood. So he was coming into this in good shape, but not great shape. And this is the data we got from that. And
yeah, but you could throw the comparison out.
Right.
I mean, come on, man. I'm just being honest.
Oh, no. Like, I'm just saying it's
just
data.
2 weeks later,
I totally get
camp in between vials of blood. Just throw the data out. Like it's not even worth.
Right. But it's not worth comparison, but it's kind of good to guide like, okay, this is interesting. What does this show that we can do to refine it? And that's kind of where I want to take it. And that's why we're going to retest because, this data, like you say, you got to start somewhere. And this data is giving us some guidelines in which to do that. And it's also going to be shared with Dr. Marks so we can kind of figure it out because he's got the same conundrum because he's using the Vespa and he's an avid mountain biker. And he's like, as a scientist, he's like you. It's like, I don't want to believe this is working, but it's working. And then he's trying to figure out how to do it because he's using it. But his science background is like, this isn't supposed to work.
But so let me help the listeners kind of understand this is you now have some data, and this is probably the most robust data that exists on a Vespa intervention. What does it initially tell you about how the product affects a human's physiology? Because you can see some of it in the respiratory data.
Yep.
Like in your eyes, what can you glean from this? And I mean, you could even turn that into a pitch like, hey, listen, we did this with this small group of athletes and this is what we saw.
Yeah. So from the pilot data from St. Mary's, from this pilot data, from the stuff Jeff's done before, we're seeing, increases in VO2 max, time to exhaustion, real high rates of fatty acid utilization. And also like with these tests, except for Jesse Haynes, who had some variables in there that influenced it, everybody went to a greater time to exhaustion on the treadmill test. And that seems to be corroborated by the data that Dr. Marks had when he began the data collection.
Yeah.
So that,
okay.
so
All right.
that
Fair. I mean, fair. Like I said,
and that's consistent with the the empirical real world evidence, that athletes are seeing, and the results in their races are showing.
But needless to say, a long way to go.
In terms of the research, sure,
yeah.
But I mean, you can't argue with the results that some of these athletes are getting. I mean, especially a guy like Jeff who's older, and Peter. I mean, Peter won hurt this year, and he's a big guy. He's 40 years old. So these aren't the young fast guys. So I think that there's some validity in that.
Well, I'm first off, I'm all about performance. And if athletes are performing, I'm a happy person, right? That's how I make my living, is getting athletes silver buckles at Western States and, get them to qualify for the Boston Marathon and win races, kind of whatever's on that continuum. But there's a lot of different ways that you can justify performance or increases in performance. And sometimes it's good athletes, sometimes it's good training, sometimes it's nutrition intervention. Usually it's a little bit of all of the above. And so whenever there is a case of an athlete did this and then achieved that, and you are essentially giving credit to whatever the intervention is, I always say, wait, hold up. Performance is always a multifactorial phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And it is never due to one specific thing. It's due to a lot of specific things adding up, but never one specific thing. So I agree with you that we can't ignore performance, but I will not take it as far as to say that this is the catalyst or the only catalyst. And I think that you would agree with that as well. There's a lot of training and a lot of talent that goes into it also.
Absolutely. But I think Jeff Browning's story is a pretty good way to highlight it, because when he came to me in late 2014, Zach said, you need to talk to Peter, because he was struggling with his GI stuff and race stuff. And, the addition of Vespa and OFM has been, basically resurrected his career and got him. And he's just consistently performed well. And Nick Curry's seen the same sort of things by adding these interventions. And to your point about it's not only a thing, one of the first things, if I was just here schlepping Vespa, and that was my only goal, was to schlep a bunch of Vespa, I would have never gone down the rabbit hole of developing programs that took fat adaptation to another level, because it's not, Vespa a great tool. The more I work with it, the more impressed I am with it. Just from an honest thing, it's amazing, but it's not the only tool. Okay. Carbohydrate restriction at certain times to get certain adaptations is important. Carbohydrate use is important. You can't just do one training modality. A lot of the people in the gym or the CrossFit thing, they poo-poo aerobic endurance training. It's like, no, you got to do that, but at the same time, you got to do resistance, you got to do intensity interval training and tempo training. You're absolutely right that there's all these things, and that's what we try to work with here at Vespa, is how do we incorporate that in a way to get those synergies to not just get performance, but long-term health. Because one of the things that I saw early on, because the only people, like some of the early adopters were pukers,
sure,
like John Olson and Jenny Capel, and that it literally turned them around. But when I started looking in the physiology of that, it's just like, I'm not against using carbohydrates when you need them, but if you're just using them all the time, it just can turn into a mess.
Well, I'll give you the last word, but just to kind of wrap it up, here's where I've come to things. I'm surrounded in anecdote. I have athletes and even myself go and experience things that I can't explain. I train good on one day and this happened. I train bad on another day. And I have that wealth of experience from 20 years of coaching of all of these athletes and all the interventions and all the nutritional trials and things like that I've tried. I could go any direction with any of those anecdotes as I can. And some of them I try, and some of them I explore and I incorporate with athletes, and then other ones I do not. And the key difference between those two, the anecdotes that I think deserve a little bit more fleshing out and trial and error with athletes, and the ones that don't, is if I can tie it back to a specific mechanism, or there is physiology underpinning what that athlete is actually experiencing, and best if there's research actually underpinning. And what I'll say with Vespa specifically, and we'll leave OFM for another 3-hour podcast.
Sure.
What I'll say with Vespa specifically, and I think you admit that those three underpinning things that I'm looking for just aren't there.
They're not there. They're not yet. But
there we go.
Right. But here's the great thing for this audience. I mean, this is ground zero. I mean, I think ultra running prides itself on being sort of boundary pushing, right? And so
100%. But you get the last word. So if that's the last word, it being ground zero, great. I'll take it. And I mean, 20 years from now, we'll be at like,
well, and the last word is at this point is those underpinnings aren't there. But, like I said before, science begins with observation, and that observation's taken place right now. We've got that observation to the point where we've got so many real world empirical data points that this begs to be looked at. And to a point, you're saying we got to look at this. And we got to start researching it because, it's so different from the normal course of action that people have just sort of said, ooh, what is this stuff? So, I mean, I understand the skepticism, but at this point, when you look at how well people are doing, particularly the older athletes, it should be, and I hope that we can do that. And where can I send you some Vespa?
I'll send you my physical address later. I'll take you up on it. You want to send me a placebo and Vespa?
I'll get with Dr. Marks and see if we can get that mixed up.
Yeah. I'm totally game for it. We can connect with that after the fact. I appreciate you coming on. You are a good sport about it. Like I said, there's a lot of people that I reach out to that I want to have a civil conversation with that just tell me to F off, and that's their right to do it. But I honestly do wish that something comes out of this one way or the other. Right.
Yeah,
I hope that you explore more of it. And I do hope that we have some more definitive things to talk about. Yeah, no.
And I think we're in this because we're passionate about it. We're certainly not in it for the money. And the ultra running sport, right? And so it's an opportunity for you to be part of this change. Like I said, I need people to tell me I got to dot my I's and cross my T's, and those I's and T's are those underpinnings you're talking about, and we're trying to work towards that. But my bias is towards working with athletes and getting them results and enjoying that, and then just thinking about what's the underlying physiology, what's going on here, what are the implications for long-term health, and so that's where I'm coming from with this, and so we'll just kind of try to move it forward with this.
Well, I appreciate it, Peter. Like I said, well stated. And I look forward to not only seeing these results, which will probably be on your website by the time this podcast comes out. I'll give a link to that.
Yep.
But also, if there's any information on any of the studies that are coming up, I'm happy to put those in the show notes as well. So
we'll continue. Yeah, we'll continue to do this. And I'm sure as we develop this, we'll have other conversations.
Cool. Thanks again, Peter. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks and a lot of respect to Peter for coming on the podcast today. I always give a lot of credit for people who come on this podcast and know that they're going to face a reasonable amount of pointed criticism that really comes from an area where I'm just trying to understand these things just like anybody else out there. So a ton of respect for Peter for agreeing to do this interview. As I mentioned during the podcast, this is an intervention and it's a nutrition product that is extremely difficult for me to recommend as a coach. Whenever I get these things fly across my desk, and I do so numerous times throughout the week, I always take the standard run of show. I want to know what's in the product. I want to know what the effective doses are. I want to know what the mechanism or potential mechanism of action is. And I want to know what the literature says about applying these interventions to athletes. And this is a case where I don't have any of those. I don't have anything across those 4 steps. So it's very hard for me to wrap my head around it and actually recommend it to athletes in order to potentially improve their performance. But y'all are grown adults out there, and you can make your own decisions. You can go to the website. You can go to Vespa's website and look at the information that they have there. You can take the information from this podcast, glean from it what you may, and make your own decisions about it. That is it for today, folks. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.